I wonder whether my pessimism is from the fact that freedom seems under threat internally and externally. First, internally, it seems we've swung from a love of freedom to a fear of it. There's a fear of free speech, for instance, a fear of individualism. Instead, we're now getting a new tribalism, new identity politics, race politics, censorship. You're being an attempt to censor you by the organisation representing psychiatrists in Canada, for instance, now. Increasing fear of freedom. Is that how you see it?
Well, again, it's a real dichotomy, isn't it? Because although my clinical license, for example, is under threat in Canada, the threat is illusory as well as real, because there isn't really anything the board of psychologists, the governing board of psychologists, can do to me that's going to stop me. And at the same time that my freedom to speak is curtailed, or attempts have been made to curtail it, I also have a platform of communication that's unparalleled in history. I don't mean me personally, I mean all of us, because we can communicate the way we're communicating right now across the world, and we can communicate with millions of other people. And so it's another reflection of this same dichotomy that's at least partly produced by accelerating technology, is that there are rapidly moving threats to freedom. We could easily turn into a surveillance state that would put what's being done in China to shame, where absolutely everything we did, every breath we take, would be monitored and controlled. And we have the technology to make that possible, and I think that's a real threat. Now, that doesn't mean it's inevitable. I think that people can decide that that's not the pathway that they want to walk down. Now, one relatively recent occurrence that might make you optimistic in a perverse manner is the fact that we did transform ourselves in the West into a totalitarian state for about 2 years. And we did that because we mimicked China, which was a very bad idea. And we did that because of the hypothetical threat of COVID, which was obviously massively overblown, but we rolled it back. And so what I would say about that is that it demonstrated that when push came to shove, people decided in favor of freedom and against restrictions, and that prevailed. And I see no reason why we couldn't continue to make the proper decisions as we move forward. Now, one of the things I've tried to do as I've toured around the world and written is also to inform people that the idea that we should pursue security and safety at the cost of freedom is an illusion, because I don't think there is any security and safety in life apart from what you might garner around yourself if you lived an honest and productive life. I think that we need to be more forthright, especially with young people, about the fact that life is an apocalyptic risk and always has been, but that the right attitude towards that isn't to hide yourself under your bed and cower and be triggered by every little occurrence that might upset you emotionally, but to face the world with some voluntary courage and find out as a consequence of doing that there's a lot more to you than you think. And this is certainly something therapists have discovered, real therapists, in the last 100 years, because we know perfectly well, and every therapist worth his or her salt knows this, that if you help people confront what they're afraid of and intimidated by programmatically and strategically and voluntarily, they get much braver and more competent. And that's the right pathway forward. And if you explain that to young people, I would say, and to older people for that matter, they're pretty damn excited about that possibility, because we're built for adventure and not for security. And if you can tell the right story of adventure, then it overwhelms the attractiveness of the story of security or the story of hedonistic gratification.
Well, golly, I think that message very much needs to be heard now, because what makes me worried more is at the same time that freedom is being under assault internally in the West, the censorship, etc., we see powerful countries that are authoritarian coming together in an alliance to challenge the West. You've got China, you've got Russia, Iran and North Korea. I mean, just last week, the Hamas terrorist group that attacked Israel sent a delegation to talk to Russia. Iran sent a delegation there too. You see them coming together. And meanwhile, in the West, you see protesters supporting the Hamas war on Israel. You had I don't know how many were in London just as you're gathering together for this conference, 100,000 or something, crowding the London Bridge, etc. It's just frightening. There's protests too against saving Ukraine from the Russian invasion.
Yeah.
It just seems to be a weak commitment to freedom inside the West, just when it's being threatened by countries that are enemies of freedom.
Well, what we're seeing play out to some degree is the continued manifestation of the oppressor-oppressed narrative that's so characteristic of the totalitarian left. And in its latest guise, it's the Palestinians are playing the role of the unjustly oppressed. And once you accept that story, well, it's easy to get your back up about it, and there are reasons for that. But, I would say at the same time, a lot of the pretensions of the authoritarian left have been stripped away in the last month. Institutions like Harvard have taken what might be permanent stains on their reputation as a consequence of being a little bit too ideological in their approach. And then I would also say, you could also view the current conflict that's emerging in the Middle East as the last gasp of the totalitarian dictators, even in the Islamic world, because my sense is that, and I believe this to be the case, that Iran fueling Hamas did that out of desperation because they know that peace is about to break through with the Abraham Accords. And it isn't obvious to me that the countries that signed the Abraham Accords, making peace with Israel, are going to retreat from that, even in the face of these large-scale public demonstrations. I don't think Iran is going to be successful in its attempts to manipulate the Arab world back into permanent enmity with the Jews in Israel and with the Western world. Now, who knows, right? Because it's a dynamic and fluid situation, but I don't think there's any reason for despair. This could well be the last gasp of the brutal dictators. I'm not overwhelmingly, naively optimistic about that, but the Abraham Accords were a major step forward, and they're not dead yet. And so I'm hoping that countries like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabia who would have signed the Abraham Accords if they would have been approached properly, let's say by the Biden administration 2 years ago, I think they may still be on board. I think that's possibly still salvageable. And so there's room for hope even on that side of the equation.
That is true. The United Arab Emirates sent out a very reassuring message of condemnation of the Hamas attacks on Israel. But you yourself were abused in a pack attack online for tweeting just after that sadistic Hamas slaughter of 1,400 Jews 3 weeks ago. Give him hell, Netanyahu. Do you regret that? I mean, should you regret it?
Well, Twitter isn't a very good medium for commenting about vital matters, and what I did in the aftermath of that was release a video explaining something like we talked about tonight, which was the relationship between the thugs in Iran and the support for Hamas and what's really going on behind the scenes. And, that was a much more intelligent approach to the problem than my more emotional response to the Hamas brutality that unfolded in Israel. And so, it's difficult to master these complex technologies of mass communication perfectly. And one of the things that I've been trying to learn is when a quick quip is appropriate and when something more thoughtful and longer form is appropriate. And in this particular situation, the longer form response was more appropriate. Do I regret it? Well, it's hard not to react with a certain degree of emotion when you see that kind of brutality reemerge. And I knew what was going on behind the scenes. I knew perfectly well that this was the death rattle of the Iranian state, or at least that's one way of looking at it. And the fact that they provoked their Hamas bullies into this brutal attack on Israel, they did it it was quite brilliant in many ways. The idea was, well, we'll have our Hamas lackeys do something so brutal that the Israelis will have to respond in kind, and given their likely military supremacy in relationship to the Hamas forces, tide will turn against the Israelis as they start to become successful. That'll divide the Arab world and scuttle the Abraham Accords. It's a pretty brilliant move, but it's a terrible thing to do in every way. I mean, I don't believe that the Arab world is properly oriented towards its own citizenry, the Islamic world, if the mullahs of Iran are their model of governance. I mean, even the people in Iran don't seem to think very highly of their totalitarian leaders. And so it isn't obvious to me that they're going to get away with this. Now, did I help or hurt that? Well, I don't know. You know, I was happy with my more considered response. And so I'm trying to learn to be judicious in emotionally responding, especially in a platform like Twitter, and to leave serious matters for longer form investigation. But, you know, live and learn. And I'm happy with the longer video I made about the thugs of Iran, let's say. So, you know, it's very difficult to do something difficult perfectly. And so you have to stumble along as you move forward and make allowances for your own stupidity. And I think that what I did was regarded to some degree as a betrayal by some of the Muslim people who had been following my work with some regard online, and that's unfortunate. And perhaps I could have handled that better, no doubt. But you know, when a situation is complex enough to cause a war, it's often going to be the case that commenting on it is a dangerous business. So, c'est la vie.
So when you're faced with, when evil betrays itself, unveils itself like this, I think it's quite understandable to, in a moment of clarity, I think by them, if you meant Hamas, give them hell, I don't know how you could want to row back from that. I mean, it's like confronting Auschwitz and not wanting to give the Nazi you know, the people responsible hell. Of course you do. I mean, some people misinterpreted, I think, what you said to a general, give Palestinians hell. I don't know that's fair at all.